Well, Daniel, look, I'm not going to interrupt this anymore, other than to welcome you to the IS and to the seminar this morning. We're all looking forward to hearing it. So over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Alan. Okay, well, look, my name is Daniel Blinkhorn. I'm going to, if I can, I might just share my screen. This is just kind of the topic that I've loosely put here. And what I'm hoping to do today is to pick some brains, really, about a couple of things that I'm interested in. I'm just a little bit of background. I'm a lecturer at the Conservatory of Music in Sydney, which is attached to and sort of part of the University of Sydney. And I was very fortunate to get this wonderful Durham fellowship, the IAS fellowship. Sadly, I was unable to sort of head over there. This kind of pandemic's really thrown a spanner in the works. But my biggest concern, I suppose, was that maybe something would have gone wrong and I wouldn't be able to get back in time to do my classes, which start next week for me. And I would have been able to hold those off for a couple of weeks, but still much longer than that. So anyway, so it's a shame that I have to do this remotely. So I do apologize for that, but I'll sort of do my best to, get through this and see. Hopefully we won't have any technical glitches or anything else. I'm kind of scripted as well. So what I'll be doing is, whilst the slides are up there, I'll just be reading a little bit, from my prepared notes, just so that I don't get too tangential or lost or anything like that. So I've just mentioned here that as part of the seminar, I'm particularly interested in discussing two lines of inquiry, and they would be here. And we can see, what I might just, if it's okay, can you just tell me, I'd like to, I'm actually just going to go to my slideshow view. Can everyone still hear me and see me? And you can see the slides?
Perfect.
Fantastic, thank you, Rob. Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of, as I mentioned, lines of inquiry that I'm interested in. The first involves my activities as artist in residence at the Sydney Nanoscience Institute. So that's part of the University of Sydney, where I found I was able to combine a burgeoning interest in biomimetics with one of the Institute's core mandates of this idea of nanosonic storytelling, which I'll get to in a moment. And the other line of inquiry is a kind of a direct response, if you like, to a question posed by the wonderful IAS Arctic Soundscapes initiative, which was, and I think I've got that just there. Just move this over here so I can see. There we go. How can the production and performance of music and sound art bring a sensitive understanding of the North to individuals outside the region, creating interactions based on dynamic, if virtual, conversation rather than external gaze? So, and that's something I've sort of been meditating on for a little while now, and hopefully I'll be able to start to kind of connect some of the dots, as it were, between these two different sorts of initiatives. But with a focus, obviously, for Durham on the Arctic soundscapes. But anyway, look, I'll just start with an overview of my activity as artist in residence at the Nanoscience Institute, because really that the kind of my approach, as you'll see, is something that I do tend to have. Oops, sorry. Yeah, my approach is the way that I typically do tend to compose and put music together. So I've just mentioned here that exposure is obviously an important aspect of the Institute. As part of their commitment to outreach, they have an artist in residence program. So in 2021, for 2021-22, I was awarded the residency initiative. And to begin to get traction, we agreed that the directive should be, and this idea here of to explore the ability of music rather, and sound to reach new audiences and connect people with science, and develop a program of expertise in audio science communication to inform and contribute to science podcasts and immersive experiences that will aim to make science communication more inclusive. So that was a fairly important part of the directive from the nanosonic, the Nanoscience Institute. As part of my activities as the 21-22 artist in residence at the Institute, I wanted to engage with a team of scientists in they have this kind of Sydney Nano Grand Challenge. So each year they have, I think it's 5 of these sort of grand challenges where the scientists get together and they decide what they'd like to sort of work on, and then they kind of pit those against one another and, you know, have a little bit of sort of friendly rivalry and that kind of thing. It's a competition. In this instance, it was examining this idea of advanced capture of water from the atmosphere, so this idea of ACWA. My involvement was in exploring the organisation of sound and the creation of soundscapes. So, as I mentioned, they wanted to be able to sort of look at how they could communicate this a little differently. And so that was the way that I sort of plugged into that initiative. Critically, I found shared ground with the science in ACWA through the concept of biomimicry. So this was kind of happenstance. I was sort of already interested in looking in exploring this path, and it just so happened that one of these grand challenges that they had was, you know, they were coming from the same place, which was really fantastic. So, as mentioned here, something I'm particularly interested in, this idea of biomimetics, and they were exploring in order to capture water from the atmosphere. So, there we go. I have this idea here of the advanced capture of water. So, in short, scientists involved in the ACWA initiative discussed how their research led them to considering the lotus effect, inspiration taken from the molecular composition of the lotus leaf, and more ostensibly, how the Namib beetle, endemic to the Namib desert in Africa, captured water in such an incredibly arid and inhospitable environment. And of course, parts of that speak to, you know, to parts of Australia, which we obviously have some pretty barren landscapes here. Basically, due to the surface of the beetle's wings slash sort of exoskeleton, it was able to fog bask at certain times of day to capture moisture in the air. During this process, water molecules were collected on the unique surface of the beetle's wings and were then channeled into its mouth. So this is how they went about sort of garnering, capturing that water. And so they were kind of interested, the scientists were interested in kind of examining these beetles, having a look at the surface of them to determine how they could sort of harness some of that sort of idea, some of those ideas to be able to put into their own research. The scientists considered this method, and after much prototyping, developed a low-cost polymer, and one whose features mimicked the beetle's unusual method of capturing water from the atmosphere. So we can see here that they've got this their goal there. So I'll just leave that up. Let's sort of read through this. I based my own explorations on a handful of mandates that the scientists devised that would help to sort of guide their research. So they had this a variety of these different sorts of ways of plugging into this central concept. And so I just kind of, this was in its infancy, I just kind of started to work with these mind maps and things. And this idea of, for instance, nano and micro scale chemical patterns which can capture water passively. And I thought, well, perhaps I can start to express that by pattern recognition patterns as textures and things. This mimicry, the idea of mimicking the iterative patterns on cells of leaves and apply augmentation and diminution to create elasticity of phrasing and things. So how I could start to sort of translate this kind of science speak into the parlance that I'm sort of more familiar with. So, so as I mentioned there, I found this kind of shared ground with the science in ACWA through their interest in biomimetics. This led me to devising some extremely simple ways of interpreting their own, the scientist research by developing a small list of process-driven techniques to create music with. So this is how I sort of, I could get into the, as I mentioned, I could start to translate some of this information. I should mention also that I didn't really want to go down the route of sonology or sonification and those kinds of things. I know that there's quite a bit of research in that sort of arena, but I was far more interested in sort of, as I mentioned, how I could take some of their concepts that were guiding them throughout the research and translate that into music. So this idea of scalability and a scalable water infrastructure system. This includes scalability, individual sound particles to entire phrases built from these particles. So using granulation or ambisonic spatialization as analogies or metaphors, examining micro, meso, macro scalability patterns and pattern dispersion built from particles. So there's a whole lot of different ways that I started to try and integrate this idea of scalability into my into my work, or at least, this is one of those, one of the techniques that I started to formulate. Nano and microscale chemical patterns, which can capture water passively, can be sound expressed through this idea of pattern reconfiguration, patterns as textures, density of shapes, or timbre of patterns, and those types of things. We have this idea here of modifying how humans interact with atmospheric water, and by local capture of water, it will provide increased efficiency by removing the need for long distance water transport. So some of these are kind of, I found it really kind of challenging to think how I can actually get that to work within my musical process. But I came up with this idea then of perhaps using, as I mentioned here, a pacing of events and gestures throughout a given soundscape. So really this idea of durations and things. I think this idea of research in plants science, which will also identify where the greater water savings can be achieved and how speeding up of the water cycles affects a plant's physiology to optimize water recycling for sustainable and high crop yields. So I kind of thought, well, this could be expressed, also explored through specialist recordings of water moving through the plants. So there's, there's a variety of specialist recording techniques. I mentioned here this idea of geophonic recording methods to try and harness some of that, and that way I can start to integrate that into these soundscapes. Or this idea of mimic the iterative patterns of cells on leaves and apply concepts like augmentation and diminution to create elasticity, of phrasing and those kinds of things, so that I could kind of get it to kind of start to shift around a little. And then I head down the bottom here, artistically moving outward to explore sound metaphors for water capture technology and how that offers a myriad of possible applications that I can start to sort of explore. And, this kind of the output and those kinds of applications and their potentiality. So there was a variety of these things that I kind of decided it's a good idea if I start to put those together, and that way I can at least navigate that sort of terrain in order to have these pieces, because really at the end of the day, I did need to, and I still am, producing, pieces of music or this idea of soundscapes and things that'll plug directly into this idea of nanosonic storytelling. So a brief summation would be, there are two discernible outcomes of my work so far. Importantly, I feel the concepts are provide shared ground rather for the creation of soundscape works to reflect the sought after less visible dimensions of the ACWA project. So really that was a really kind of critical part of it. And I've just put here texture density and this idea of spatial morphology form the works DNA used as textile within creative works. And that bottom one that I have there, enabling sound to express dimensions of scale and size, evoke memory, and form a backdrop of narration for research into how nature can inform nanotechnology. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier in one of these slides, and I might just go back there just for a second. So we can see up here on the top left-hand side, this idea of nanosonic stories. So they mentioned in that nanosonic story researchers effective ways to communicate nanoscience through sound using original compositions of music, soundscapes, and oral storytelling. This catalyst finds new ways to audibly illustrate scientific concepts and articulate emotions inspired by science at some of the smaller scale. So, and there's a series of podcasts and all kinds of things that they were looking at and we've been sort of producing in order to diffuse this this kind of creative aspect of translating the scientific information. Now, I've just mentioned here that unsurprisingly, I found the most natural way in this topic as both a composer and sound artist was to consider compositional process. And that's just what I do. I'm hugely sort of process-based when it comes to the way I put material together, in particular when I'm sort of interpreting, sort of acoustic, ecoacoustics and those kinds of things. So I've mentioned here mapping a number of techniques to sculpt sound, either digital or electroacoustic or acoustic ways of transforming sound based on specific criteria. The techniques and processes that I used were functional, resulting in some interesting compositional work. However, given the subject matter radiates across the sciences and arts, I'd relish observations from others within the group, in particular, given the seminar's trajectory whereby each fellow is asked to present to the group a core idea that informs their current work or a problem that they're tackling. So for me, really, the problem is how I can sort of more effectively start to plug into biomimicry and how I can, use that in a little more sort of an informed way within compositional process. So what I might just do here is I might just play a little bit of the second section. This is just a kind of snippet that came out of the second section of this work based on, so I got all of those sorts of techniques that I've discussed before and sort of put that together in a variety of ways and started to transform the sound and let that inform how the piece came together. So the first section was really about, it was more sort of, based on the sort of beetle and how it kind of collects water. This second instance here, this second part, really deals with in the lab where there's all kinds of wonderful experimentation going on as they were trying to develop these this polymer and that kind of thing. So look, I'll just play a bit of this. Can you just tell me if you're able to hear? Can we all hear that?
Yep.
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 Okay, so I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that's the idea being that using, as I mentioned, some of that information that I'd sort of garnered and then translated, I kind of started to put together this piece. It was sort of diffused via, we had some radiophonic stuff that we were doing, some podcasts, and then also an installation. So, you know, the piece in its entirety runs for 30 or 40 minutes. And so I've just kind of, we can let that sort of run in the background whilst they've got perhaps, you know, in particular when they were presenting the grand challenge as part of that sort of final, final roundtable that they had. There were a variety of these booths set up with different kinds of discussions that were occurring in each of those. And of course, some of that material was presented there as well. So that kind of then brings me forward to this idea of exploring Arctic soundscapes. And so what I really hope to achieve now, or what I rather, as part of the fellowship, like to try and sort of instigate is this, this way of being able to work probably in a little more of an informed way, because as I mentioned, I'm hugely sort of process driven when it comes to my compositions. And the way that I approached it when I first started working with environmental sound, I found it very difficult to try and find a way in to be able to start working with it in a way that really kind of was sensitive to the material, but also allowed me to have some of my compositional sensibilities and apply those over the top. So it was very important to be able to sort of balance the two. And so I've sort of started to, you know, as I mentioned, develop a variety of these different kinds of processes and things. And in the second lecture, in the lecture that I'll give, I'll probably discuss that in more detail. Ironically, just as a way of being able to sort of understand you know, why I've chosen to organize the material in my pieces the way that I do. I have also had some previous experience in sort of Arctic regions, and I've gone up to both in Alaska and Svalbard, and taken some recordings and those kinds of things. But again, I sort of just approached that in a similar way to that the piece you just heard, this Biomimetics University piece, a similar kind of way. So I'd like to try and perhaps, and given in particular that radiates across different disciplines and things, you know, garner some observations and some insights from many of you. So look, that's the end of that sort of kind of formal presentation, as it were. I'll just stop sharing that screen. Oh, stop recording. I just want to stop sharing. Has that stopped sharing now?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you, Alex. Yeah. So look, from here, I mean, I don't know. Again, one of the things that I typically do tend to do is really lean into just process and devising these kinds of techniques and things. But I don't know really how kind of successful that is in perhaps even really speaking to this concept of biomimicry, you know, because in many ways I'm sort of solving all kinds of problems and all sorts of challenges, but I don't know, I'd like some other sort of tools to start to work with and develop some other tools that will help me to sort of communicate some of these ideas, in particular when I'm working with environmental sound. And that was the idea of this wonderful Soundscapes project, was that we could start to, and there are a couple of core sort of suggestions around that we could sort of start to tease things apart and look at how we can material to get from that. So obviously metaphor is a large one as well for me. For anybody that is interested, I'll just do a little bit of plugging, I suppose. I did release a suite of works called One Dog Night. You can hear that on Spotify and those kinds of streaming platforms, but that actually that's just a whole suite of field recordings. There's one exception, which is sort of with a coral reef, but the others are all just recordings of Arctic regions. And the way that I've put those together in a compositional perspective, in particular, sort of, I'm more of a kind of, I'm coming from more of that traditional compositional end of the spectrum as opposed to sort of the sound arts and that kind of thing. So that probably does also speak to why I have such a penchant for using and developing processes and things. Anyway, look, I might just stop talking there and get some. I thought perhaps we could get some ideas and some suggestions around this. I do forgive me. I didn't want to sort of prate on with a really long presentation needlessly, because really I just wanted to show you the sorts of things that I've been doing both within that project over at Sydney Nanoscience and the one that I'm sort of plugging into now as part of the IAS. And so I thought I'd just kind of keep it the presentation fairly brief and just sort of discuss perhaps.
That's great. Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm really sorry that at this end we may be having some technical problems. We do have some people on the call. I don't know how the sound has been for everyone. I know Nyanika hasn't been able to join us. If I disappear, just keep the conversation going.
Okay, all right.
I don't know what. As Linda said, there's a strike day in Durham, and maybe the computer systems are on strike as well. So. But look, that was fascinating. I managed to catch quite a lot of it. But I open to everyone on the call whether there are any questions for you now, or I guess from what you've said, Daniel, you're looking for discussion really rather than questions, yeah?
Look, I think so, Alex. Questions are great. I'm happy to answer any of those or sort of, but yeah, really the idea, I mean, they may very well lead to, some insights into things anyway. So it might be a nice way to kind of start.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So if anyone has a question, if they could put their hand up or type them in the chat, I'll try and monitor both.
Alex, could I please
yeah.
Could I please ask a question? Daniel, good morning. My name is Patrick Zook. I'm the Arts and Humanities Director. I must apologise. A number of us seem to have problems joining the call. I just see from the chat and emails that have been exchanged that my colleague Nyanika couldn't get in. So I'm afraid I missed the very start of your presentation. But thank you very much for a most interesting seminar. I wanted to ask you, Daniel, just for many. If we can ask perhaps a rather naive question, for many artists, the thought of being involved in, scientific projects or taking inspiration from scientific work might seem a little odd. So could you tell us something just about how you feel the experience has actually stimulated you creatively and intellectually? Do you think you've taken away something very new?
I think I have. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I do kind of think that I have, because ordinarily I don't kind of move in that sort of sphere of influence at all. I've always been interested in it, but it's sort of, I love the language that is used, but most of it's lost on me. But I can certainly, in particular with this, and what I was excited about with this was that when I sort of had a look at this grand challenge, and there was a variety of these different sorts of scientific initiatives that were going on, they kind of, when they mentioned this idea of getting inspiration from that nimid beetle and looking at biomimicry, that's when my sort of ears picked up, because I really, for me, that's something that I've been really interested in trying to integrate more in my own sort of artistic language. Because as I mentioned, I found it really very daunting when I first started working with environmental sound to try and sort of navigate that and compose pieces and make artistic pieces out of it. When most of the time, I think a lot of the sort of research goes into sonification and a variety of these other kinds of ways of just creating data sets and all of that kind of stuff, which I don't typically tend to do. So I had to then start to think, well, how can I perhaps navigate this terrain a little differently? Yeah, so I probably don't know whether I answered your question, but I do find it daunting, but I certainly did get, I feel, it did stimulate a whole lot of, for me, different ways of being able to approach the material.
Sure, and I'm curious too, Daniel, just in terms of compositional technique or ideas for the treatment of texture or sonority in your work, did you feel that there were specific things that you were able to take away that might perhaps prompt new developments as when you're in your approach as a composer?
I think so, yeah. Once again, I do. I've always been, I sort of had to find my own way into working with, in particular, this idea of acousmatic music and electroacoustic music. But there are certain sort of sensibilities there, and there's a renowned sort of field recordist called Bernie Krause who came up with this idea of a niche hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So there's that, and there's this idea of spectral morphology with the sort of Dennis Smalley sort of thing. There's a variety of these things that are sort of percolating away, and they've kind of helped to inform the way that I choose to work with materials, because, as I mentioned, it's really important for me that it retains an essence of the place in the sound works. So rather than just having presenting some really abstract material where it doesn't sort of, it's not tethered to any of that original material. That kind of terrifies me in a sense. I like to be able to keep it grounded so that you can actually hear that sense of place and space and that original material within it. Because otherwise I then start to think, well, I might as well work with synthesis or a variety of other ways of generating material, or with just acoustic instruments in general, and sort of composing from that perspective, which, is just wonderful, but that's not why I've been doing what I've been doing. So, yeah.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think Bob has his hand up for a question.
Yes, good evening, Daniel. Good morning, everybody else.
Hi, Bob, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, I see Eric's back with us as well. I know people are having some difficulties this morning, I think, coming in and out. But on behalf of that, I know that unfortunately Phil can't be here today. He was away last week in New York, and then he's now teaching and then on strike, I think. And crazy British things we do. But on behalf of all of us, thank you again very, very much indeed. We're very excited. I am, as you know, a dyed-in-the-wool, Dirty Wellies Brigade biologist of the very worst kind, my colleagues tell me. But I very, very much appreciate the approach in terms of the nano side of things. We have lots of nano work going on in our own department, and I found that piece of there very, very evocative. And I think the second part particularly, as you say, when you start tearing apart molecules, or you start thinking about this whole thing coming together. And I, as a biologist, I recognize that in sound, which is really stimulating to me. On the Arctic soundscape side of things, we're very, very excited at the moment. I know that we couldn't go with you, sadly, to Svalbard, and you couldn't join us there, but three of our people did. Three of our people did get there. Did get to this place called Andenes, and they have begun already to make some sounds of the whales chasing the cod and the clicks and all those sort of things from Yarn. Here's Brit as well. Brit's made it, and I know they've had a wonderful time. And it's just at the very beginning of some discussions of development of this Valand, this whale, this international museum. And I know we've just begun talking, and when Phil is now fully back with us, we will be back in touch with you very directly, because at the ground floor of that development, in terms of their impact, soundscapes are going to be very important to them. And I think working with you, particularly again in transformation of some of the recorded sounds development that you've been doing today on a larger scale, admittedly, I think will be a really, really important part of that. So it's and I know Brit's nodding there as well, which is great. So three people were able to get there. We are moving this forward. And we will be going again we will hopefully get there again in June from that postponement. I know after the period, but we want to try and move this forward. So yeah, I was absolutely stunned by this. I think the biomimicry side of things at the different scales speaks very loudly, I think, to me, because as I say, when you know the biology behind some of those things like the Beatles, I think that was spot on. I think it really does, in my mind, if I close my eyes, that really is the sort of processes that I would expect to hear. So thank you. Anyway, no question, just comments really, because
thank you.
I find it very stimulating.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's difficult because often, you're kind of working in isolation when you're putting these things together, although it's based on all kinds of ideas and things, but it's wonderful to have this kind of, to get this kind of feedback and to have this kind of exchange. Just as, for me, it doesn't happen anywhere near as much as it should. And, I would hope to also, I did notice that you'd mentioned something about the initiative perhaps pushing forward in June. I might have to have a discussion with you about that.
Sure, of course, absolutely.
Because I was so disappointed that I wasn't able to. I was going to head up there with my son at the time, and I was just devastated that we weren't able to sort of get up there. And I haven't seen that part of the Arctic. I have over in the sort of Alaskan side, but not in Svalbard in the middle of winter. So it must be. But the thing is, I was really kind of curious to know sonically how I could work with that, because it's very different to the time that before that, when I went there and things were melting and there was all kinds of activation of sounds, and it was really very sort of charismatic, and there was a lot occurring. Whereas I figure in the dead of winter it's probably going to be quite different. So I thought it would have been challenging. But anyway.
Yes, well, we were very sad to do that too. But I think, as I say, what was really good was that at least we were able to have Brit and Suzanne and Jana being able to be in Andenes and begin these conversations, which actually have been, I think, much more beneficial even than we could ever have hoped for in some ways, I think, in terms of some of these things. So we'll be talking with you more about how that might now develop as we sort of let's not say post-COVID, late COVID times, but yeah, I because I think, as I say, for me, some of the biological sounds there, and I'm sure Eric will be saying the same in terms of the sorts of working together on these processes. I think I can really foresee some really tangible soundscape outputs, which all different levels of people interacting, for example, with the whale or with the space station and such like, can be there as a permanent, at very least temporary, but hopefully some more of a permanent interaction of the work that we would do together here, in terms of both Norway and beyond. It will be very international in its outlook, and I think that's that's really great. So to be involved with you at this early stage is wonderful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bob. I mean, it's as I say, the opportunity to be able to do this, you kind of summed it up there, but I do hope that it can get some traction, where people can see this sort of and connect those dots, if you like. I like to try and connect dots for people.
No, I think that's very much what we're after as well. I think it's that longer term legacy. I know, overused word, I know, but in a sense, it is that we can. We can come together from quite different backgrounds, very disparate backgrounds, but yet have a very similar aim. I think is I say is very exciting to all of us. Otherwise, you wouldn't be involved. But yeah, thank you.
It is, Bob. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. And Daniel, if in case you haven't seen the chat, so just say Eric doubles down on everything Bob's just said.
All right. I haven't seen the chat either. So.
But like me, his connection keeps dropping out.
It keeps dropping out. Yeah.
Susanna has asked a question as well, just to say thanks so much for the presentation. Biomimicry is so fascinating, especially in relation to water. But maybe you could say a bit more on how a sound level that works, if not only metaphorically. Plasticity of DNA is a different timescale in my intuition. Hope that's not Susanna's misunderstanding.
Sorry, it cut out just a little bit there, Alex.
Sorry, the question's in the chat. That may be easier.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. There we go.
The top question in the chat from 848-555.
Okay. Yep. So sound level that works is not only metaphorically. I don't know if I quite understand the question. You'll have to forgive me. I'm not quite sure. So it says a bit more about the sound level that works, if not only metaphorically. Well, I think that was one of the things that I kind of at the sort of little summation that I had there. There was this kind of, I wanted to sort of see if I could balance the quantitative and sort of qualitative aspects of it. So I just kind of mentioned that, but that was in reference to the way that I put material together, from the ground up, not necessarily in terms of the sort of the plasticity of DNA is a different time scale in my intuition. Yeah. Well, the thing is that really it was timescales in general. Once that sort of that door opens, and we can start to kind of explore that and different sorts of pacings of events and that type of thing. That's probably my only at this stage. That's the only way that I know of being able to get in there and sort of engage directly with the material to try and interpret it, if you like. So that's just kind of faster pacing events and kind of different kinds of internal, movements that they have and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so really it's critical for me, but I don't quite know differentially my intuition.
That's great, Daniel. Just say there's another question just coming. In case I drop out again, there's another question at the bottom of the chat.
All right. Okay, yeah.
From again, Alex Carr, who couldn't get into the first half, but is interested about that aspect of developing common language with scientists. Have you ever, or would you work with visual artists?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of visual art myself, very poorly, but I do find that kind of thing fascinating, and I have worked with them. And again, I probably do approach it in the same way. There's a very old piece by Georgi Ligeti called Articulation, and he kind of wrote the piece. We'll put that together with a couple of helpers, as it were, in a lab, and he built this beautiful electronic piece. And then afterwards, an artist, and I can't remember his name, this visual artist came along and visualized it. And to me, because it was kind of, he didn't just speak to this idea of intuitively what the artist was able to do was, when Ligeti had this kind of reverb, this spatial aspect, the artist was able to actually intuitively capture that just by having a kind of a shadow effect around some of these different sorts of geometries and things that he'd presented. And I just found that to be really fascinating. So that for me probably, and I do use that as an example in a lot of my classes, because I talk and try and get all of my students to actually design visual scores and all kinds of things in order to just visualize music, because I do think about music in terms of sound, shapes. That's very, very important for me. So when I'm looking in with art, I can always find an inroad, because I mean, there's a lot of gesture in it. There's a lot of, sort of different kinds of geometries and things. So, and again, I can easily, these days, I can very easily look at a visual, work and translate that directly into sort of musical process if I need to, because I've spent quite a bit of time trying to work on that aspect. So I don't know if that answered the question there.
That's great.
So yeah, with the visual artist, definitely. I mean, that kind of thing for me is just because it then creates this beautiful synergy between the two kind of components. Even if they're working against one another, there is still this kind of beautiful synergy that you can start to impart that becomes, it radiates across those different sorts of disciplines within the artistic community. So it's, really fantastic. Yeah. But I do apply the same, if you like, methodology. I just translate all of that material in the same way that I do probably, as I mentioned, with the more scientific end of the spectrum. I try and find a way that I can sort of visualize well, as I mentioned, sort of different kinds of geometries and different sorts of gestures and pacing of events and all of that sort of thing. And then I can just translate that very easily into musical sort of vernacular, as it were. Yeah. Hopefully that answered the question. I'm sure.
That's great, Daniel. And again, apologies if I drop out, but so I'm a neuroscientist, and it's sort of interesting to hear you talk about these things as well, and making me think about whether I have sounds of the processes that are going on that I'm working on and so on. Yeah. But I guess it relates to Susanna's question about timescale when you're talking about those biological systems and things that happen at different time scales.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
How do you work that into your own work? How do you deal with things happening at different time scales?
I actually find that really kind of that's one of the most important aspects of my pieces, because I might have a time scale for a series of events that are occurring really quite quickly. And then underneath that, there might be something that's occurring quite slowly. Again, you could probably equate that to Olivier Messiaen had a beautiful sort of little basic chart that he just kind of divided that up. So he had ratios of things, and he had this sort of different sorts of rhythmic proportions, and then he had the ratios of that and could sort of work it all out like that. So you can probably do that in a similar way. I mean, I do tend to do that. I started doing that intuitively, and then sort of became more and more conscious of what it was that I was doing. So then started to sort of, work with that more. But that's critical to any of my works. There's always a lot of internal movement in there, and there's always varying timescales that are kind of working either with one another or against. But the most important thing is, irrespective, that I'm trying to sort of speak to a specific kind of concept that I might have in mind when I'm working. So if there's something that I see that the gestures might, be a sort of a slower time scale, and then you've got these faster time scales that are going over the top. I always try and integrate that into my pieces. Absolutely, yeah. And look, I guess in a sense, I remember the first time that I heard a sort of an accelerandy. It was in an orchestral piece of a particular percussion instrument, whilst the rest of the orchestra was. It had a ritardando, and so you had this beautiful kind of the speeding up of this one instrument against the backdrop of the rest of the instrument, sort of slowing down in terms of their meter. So for me, that kind of, again, I was able to, and that was sort of early on. That really piqued my interest, and I thought, wow, I need to be able to do a lot more of that in what I do, because it's a beautiful technique, and it's really expressive, and
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I don't even, and all of that stuff's kind of become intuitive now. It's just so embedded and ingrained in my sort of artistic process. But it is critical, absolutely. Yeah, it's very important.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else? Any questions or comments? Dan, I think from what the chat is saying, everyone's found this fascinating. People may be in touch afterwards. Patrick, you have another question.
Yes, please, Alex. Daniel, could I also ask, do you conceptualize your artistic practice as a form of research? Is that concept helpful or useful?
Look, I do. I have to, I guess, because it's part of the university's mandate that we have a research output. So that all gets kind of thrown into this basket of non-traditional research output. But look, at the same time, there are. In this instance, with the Nanosciences Institute, I mean, that kind of thing is, they were looking for another way to be able to sort of communicate, that type of research. So I do tend to think that it's quite important, and that it does have that sort of research-facing aspect to it. Yeah. So, and in particular, I guess with the stuff that I did up in the Arctic, I'm just trying to think of the name of the place. It was in a beautiful fjord in Svalbard. But the material that I sort of composed from that's kind of, it's very important that it does, as I mentioned before, it retains a sense of place and space and that kind of thing. But that also does help to communicate this idea of, well, it kind of had, one person's sort of journey as it was a trapper that lived out in the wilds, and he was kind of disfigured and lived really amongst all of these really, really harsh sorts of, the environment that he was in was really, very challenging. And so I try to embed that into the work and just, give a feel for the place and the time that he was sort of, the kinds of things that he may have experienced, I suppose. But I would hope that kind of does help to communicate that specific region a little more so. Sorry, I got a bit tangential there, but yeah, I would hope so, Patrick. I mean, I'm encouraged to, as I mentioned, as part of the university, but irrespective, I would like to think so, that it does have that kind of research-facing output. Yeah. Yeah, but it's an excellent question, because it's
great.
Sorry, Patrick.
No, I beg your pardon, Daniel. Just there was a slight delay on the call, so I didn't mean to cut across you.
No.
I suppose I was just wondering that all artistic creation is in its own way a form of looking, a form of seeking. So
yes.
Creativity isn't necessarily as incompatible with the university research agenda as one might think at first sight. I suppose the interesting thing too is that if you find yourself working in environments, coming into contact with people or engaged in projects that you mightn't previously have thought of, that presumably too can provide valuable new stimulus. For creative
it does. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a funny thing. I mean, a large part of what I do is pretty isolated, in the sense that I'm sort of working alone, and I've got a variety of these things that are percolating away as I put the pieces together. But at the same time, being able to, sort of connect and have those kinds of discussions and that kind of thing with people from very specific regions, And I got to actually experience quite a bit of that up in Alaska, which was really fantastic because the sort of Indigenous people up there in that sort of community, in that area, I should say. They just have some really, they have a very different way of looking at things. It's the same with the Indigenous culture that we have here in Australia. They have a very, for me, the Dreamtime is just something that's just, it's remarkable. I mean, it's just such an unusual way of being able to it's part of their mythology. And so being able to discuss those kinds of things with them is, it's fascinating. I don't think that always leads to something. I think that's probably maybe if I, again, got a bit tangential there, but yes, that always leads to, definitely leads to something. Patrick, sorry about that.
Sure. I'm sure we'll all be extremely interested to see how the project develops, Daniel. It sounds like there's some very interesting synergies between the members of the team.
Yeah, look, I'm looking forward to it as well. It's probably, I get the feeling that it's probably just had a couple of hiccups there at the start, but I think it's probably starting to gain momentum now, which is great. It's really good. And what's nice also is that because I'm doing that sort of residency over in the nanosciences thing, I'm able to kind of, spend a bit of time immersed in one project, and then I can sort of flip over to the other one. I'm really looking forward to that as it moves forward. That's probably going to get me through this semester of teaching. I've got a very heavy teaching load, so that's probably going to be my, my little outlet, I think, in order to keep me sane. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the project sort of. And I think it'll go from strength to strength.
Very good. Well, very best of luck with the next stages, Daniel. And I hope we might have a chance to have contact with you again later in the
absolutely
later in the project's course.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. And Daniel, thank you so much. I know it's been difficult with the technical issues, so I apologise for that. But I think considering those, you've still managed to engage the audience, and everyone wants to know more. So that's a good sign, and I'm really pleased to see it. And hopefully, it's a good sign for the project too. But Daniel, thank you very much for that. It was a really interesting talk, really interesting chat afterwards as well.
Yeah.
So I really value that.
Yeah, that was, to me, I'm so pleased that I was able to sort of have a chat. And forgive me, I've had a bit of a long day, and it's probably taking its toll on me now, but it's just been fantastic. I really appreciate the chance to be able to chat.
Brilliant.
And discuss this stuff. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Much appreciated. And there is a virtual round of applause going on, I'm sure. There you go.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Thank you. See you later.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.